Hello everyone! Welcome back to another episode of Doodling Through Education. For my CC students, this is Cycle 3, Week 3, History. For everyone else, that just means that we're going to be talking about the Boston Tea Party. So, as always, we will talk about what this event was, when did it happen, and what were the events that led up to it, as well as what happened after it. So remember, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this channel so that you never miss an episode. So on that note, let's start doodling. So before we jump into the Boston Tea Party, we kind of need to set the stage and understand what was happening at this period of time to be able to understand why the Boston Tea Party happened. In the 1760s, Britain was in a great deal of debt, and due to this, had imposed several different types of taxes to make up for this deficit. One of those was the Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed a large tax on any type of printed paper, anything from pamphlets and playing cards to legal documents and newspapers were all taxed heavily. And this tax was unfairly only aimed at the colonists and not any of the mainland British citizens. The Townshend Acts of 1767 took this idea even farther by taxing essentials that people would have to buy, like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. This enraged the colonists because they felt that these taxes were unfair because they did not have any representation in Parliament. Essentially, there was not a colonist present in Parliament to defend their interest. Hence the term that is widely known as no taxation without representation. Only 3 years later, on March 5th, 1770, a fight broke out in the streets of Boston between some colonists who were acting a bit unruly toward a group of British soldiers. They began to throw snowballs and ice at the soldiers, and the reinforcement soldiers returned fire with their guns, killing 5 colonists. This would later be termed the Boston Massacre. So taking these incidents into mind helps to build the picture of the growing frustration that the colonists had toward Britain at the time. The next action from the British Parliament set the stage for what would become the Boston Tea Party. Although as time went on, Britain did repeal some of these taxes. One thing that was still highly taxed was tea. Because of this, many colonists decided to boycott or stop drinking tea that was brought by the British East India Company. And instead, a group of tea smugglers would bring in Dutch tea. This left the British East India Company with millions of pounds of surplus tea and facing bankruptcy. Samuel Adams was one of the men who opposed this tax. He led a group of men called the Sons of Liberty, who all opposed taxes of this nature. Led by Adams, the Sons of Liberty held meetings rallying against British Parliament and protested the Griffin's Wharf arrival of a ship named the Dartmouth, which was a British East India Company ship carrying tea. By December 16, 1773, the Dartmouth had been joined by her sister ships, the Beaver and the Eleanor. all 3 ships were loaded with tea. That morning, as thousands of colonists convened at the wharf and its surrounding streets, a meeting was held at the Old South Meeting House, where a large group of colonists voted to refuse to pay taxes on this tea or allow the tea to even be unloaded, stored, sold, or used. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the ships to return to Britain and ordered the tea tax be paid and the tea unloaded. The colonists refused, and Hutchinson never offered a satisfactory compromise. In the night, a large group of men, many reportedly members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves in Native American clothes and boarded these ships. They proceeded to throw 342 chests of tea into the water. It took nearly 3 hours for the more than 100 colonists to empty the tea into Boston Harbor. These chests held more than 90,000 pounds of tea, or 45 tons, which would cost nearly $1 million today. So, what happened after this took place? Despite the lack of violence, the Boston Tea Party didn't go unanswered by King George III and British Parliament. In retribution, they passed the Coercive Acts, which were later known as the Intolerable Acts, which, number 1, closed Boston Harbor until the tea lost in the Boston Tea Party was paid for. Number 2, ended the Massachusetts Constitution, which ended free elections of town officials. Number 3, moved judicial authority to Britain and British judges for all matters. This basically created martial law in Massachusetts. 4, they required that the colonists open their homes to British troops if they were demanded to do so. And number 5, it extended the freedom of worship to French Canadian Catholics under the British rule, which really angered the mostly Protestant colonists. Britain hoped the Coercive Acts would squelch rebellion at this time and keep the remaining colonies from uniting, but in fact, the opposite happened. All the colonies viewed the punitive laws as further evidence of Britain's tyranny and rallied to Massachusetts' aid, sending supplies and even plotting further resistance. On September 5th, 1774, the elected delegates from all 13 of the American colonies, except Georgia, met in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress to figure out how to resist British oppression. And this was the beginning of the Revolution. And that is all we have for today. Remember, as always, go home, talk with your parents about the Boston Tea Party, talk with your siblings, research more, never stop learning, and we will see you next time. Remember to be kind, follow God's will, and take care. Bye.